Hello and buckle up because I got a wild one for you today. We're going to be talking about early modern English lexicon. What is lexicon? Lexicon is just words, or as Hamlet put it, words, words, words. And so we're going to talk about developments in vocabulary in the early modern English period, which is kind of the period where English went from being a kind of normal language in terms of the number of words it had to being like just absolutely just big. It's a big language. There's a big dictionary, lots of words. There's words for everything. There's multiple words for everything. Let's talk about the early English language lexicon. So the first thing you really should know is that it was during this period that we get the third big dump of vocabulary from other languages, a big bunch of borrowing from other languages. We had, originally Old English, mostly Germanic, a few loanwords in specific domains. Middle English, big loads of French, little bits of Latin, but lots of French comes in. And then in the early modern period, because of a number of cultural developments, which we'll talk about in this video, we get a whole lot of words from Latin and Greek into early modern English. And so in the 1500s, you have all these scholars who are studying Greek and Latin and are really, really into the classics. And there's a kind of a rise in university and the culture of learning and education in England on a scale that has never existed before. Also a rise in the prestige of English as a language. And so people are writing more in English, whereas in 1350, everyone educated would write in Latin. In the 1500s, they're writing in English. But they don't have words in English for everything. So they just start taking words from Latin and putting them into English. And this results in what were called at the time, as a term of criticism, Inkhorn Words. Inkhorn words were words that were associated with scholars and scholarship and educated people. And it was a kind of a metonymy based on this device here, which was an inkhorn, which was something that you carried around your ink and pen in to write with. And this was a bit of technology that was associated with scholars and educated and learned people. So the idea was that these were not words that were used by ordinary, regular people. These were words that were only used by pretentious academic types like myself. And it set off a debate. This guy here, Thomas Wilson, who wrote one of the first Arts of Rhetoric in English, a kind of composition handbook for writing in English, one of the first, wrote the following. Among all other lessons, this should first be learned that we never affect here means put on, to kind of pose, that we never affect, like being affected, we never affect any strange inkhorn terms, but to speak as is commonly received, neither seeking to be over fine or yet living over careless, using our speech as most men do, and ordering our wits as the fewest have done. Some seek so far for outlandish English, and outlandish here means literally foreign, right? He's using a old Germanic kind of a compound word here, and ending, practicing what he preaches. Some seek so far for outlandish English that they forget altogether their mother's language. And I dare swear this, if some of their mothers were alive today, they were not able to tell what they say. And yet these fine English clerks, and a clerk here means a scholar, will say they speak in their mother tongue, if a man should charge them for counterfeiting the king's English. So there's a lot of evaluation and prescription here. He's saying that you want to talk nicely, you don't want to talk coarsely, but you don't want to affect all these big fancy $5 words here, because at what point are you not even speaking English anymore? And he's saying this because there was a huge amount of writing that did have lots of Greek words, lots of Latin words, and there was no dictionary, so people would just take Latin words and kind of put them into English. A lot of this was a result of an important cultural development that we might describe, or is often described as Renaissance humanism. Humanism in this period does not mean what humanism sometimes means in the present day, which is a kind of at the present day, it refers to a certain set of secular values that sort of place human values, human thriving, and human happiness at the center of our ethics and morality. There's a connection to Renaissance humanism, but no, they're not the same thing. Renaissance humanists were almost entirely Christian. The term humanism comes from the Latin studia humanitatis, which means the study of the humanities. And the humanities here, a term we still use, humanities was in contrast to the other basic major thing that you studied at a university, which was the studia divinitatis, the study of divinity, like a divinity school, and that was theology and biblical study and stuff like that. So studia humanitatis was often studying the classics. And so during this period that involved the recovery of ancient Greek texts, which had been lost in Western Europe for many centuries, they began to be recovered in the 1200s with the translation of ancient Greek texts out of Arabic, where Arab scholars had for many generations, while Europe was struggling and very poor, the Islamic world was having its own golden age, and they were preserving all these texts by Aristotle, which were then translated into Arabic, out of Arabic into Latin mostly in Western Europe during the 1200s, the 1300s, into the 1400s. But in the 1400s, Western European scholars, for various historical reasons I'm not going to get into here because otherwise this lecture could go on a really long time, start recovering ancient Greek texts, and knowledge of ancient Greek is recovered more and more in the West. And when this happens, other things happen. For example, the corpus of Plato, besides a few texts that had been Latinized early on, passes Aristotle in prestige and esteem. Education becomes increasingly not for theology, but to cultivate an ideal statesman through training in classical rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of speaking well, of being eloquent, of being able to win people's hearts and minds. There's a kind of artificiality to it, which has made it susceptible to criticism going back to ancient Greece. Socrates was a critic of rhetoric. But there was this idea that, rhetoric is designed to persuade people, but rhetoric can be used for good by good people. If the truth is important, it needs all the help it gets, and that help includes knowing things like rhetorical devices and how to structure a speech. And so the orator, the speaker, the person who assembles the crowd, who addresses the assembled crowd, becomes a culture hero in this kind of retro way that resurrects this sort of fantasy of the classical Roman and Greek world in ways that still have implications for us, right? There's a legacy from that to our own foundation in the United States as a republic along classical lines, and ideas about citizenship. Renaissance humanism also included, to a certain extent, ideals of intellectual freedom and individual expression. And this went hand in hand with the search for correct texts, a major threshold in the Renaissance humanism was a scholar named Lorenzo Valla in the 1400s who, through philological study, determined that a document called the Donation of Constantine, which was purportedly a document that went back to the 300s when the Emperor Constantine, who, as you might know, converted to Christianity, donated the Roman Empire to the Pope. And the Pope said, "Okay, thank you very much, but I'll give it to you on permanent loan, Roman Emperor." And so this was used in the Middle Ages as a document to kind of like establish papal supremacy over earthly authorities. Lorenzo Valla discovered that this text was, based on the kind of Latin that it used, could not have been written earlier than the 800s, and therefore was in no way connected to Constantine. It was a forgery. So this is an example of how the mental habits and kinds of study that were cultivated by Renaissance humanism contributed to a new sense of intellectual freedom, personal kind of stake in things. And of course, this goes hand in hand with the Reformation as well, where scholars in the 1500s will look at the Bible and decide that their interpretation is better than that of the magisterium of Rome and of the traditional received interpretations that have been handed down by the theologians at universities through the centuries. Thomas More here was a humanist scholar, also a Catholic, who was a martyr of the Catholic faith for resisting Henry VIII's attempts to, or Henry VIII's desire to kick out the authority of the Catholic Church and to get a divorce and do all these things. And he was a great admirer of individual expression and intellectual freedom, but he also saw danger in the Christian faith fracturing into many, many different sects, and believed that the unity of Christendom was more important than doctrinal perfection across the board. Obviously, Martin Luther and John Calvin and many other people disagreed with him, and so a lot happens in the 1500s. And you can go back to the Bible in the early modern English, early modern England video to learn more about that. But a lot of what also went on was that developed as a part of Renaissance humanism was a sense of historicity, which is to say the idea that history wasn't just events, battles, kings, successions of families or dynasties. History also brought changes in attitudes, customs, mentalities. The idea that the past is a foreign country, is as I think George Bernard Shaw put it, was an idea that really develops in the Renaissance under the influence of humanist ideas. So, what else? A little bit more about the study of humanities and education. A lot of this is about education and how people were educated. So those of you who are studying education or teachers might find this interesting. The curriculum changed, and there was this idea of the introduction of this type of education called paideia, which was a course of general education preparing young men for active citizenship in the polis. This would have been based on the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, but with rhetoric newly ascended over grammar and dialectic, which had been more favored in the Middle Ages. It also involved studying arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, the liberal arts are called the liberal arts not because they're like woke social justice warrior arts, but because they were the arts of free people. Liber means free. So the idea, and live free in the early modern period, as through much of human history, to be free was to be a property owner, to be part of an elite. So the liberal arts were the arts that were cultivated by the elite for rulership, as opposed to the practical or mechanical arts like soldiery or architecture or medicine or law or like basket weaving, whatever. Like the liberal arts aren't attached to any particular vocation, but to cultivating a kind of person. And this ideal still, to some extent, informs the university, although in present day, here in Missouri, we have the Department of Education and Workforce Development. So there's still that kind of tension between what education is for and who gets to be the liber, who gets to be free, right? Who gets to enjoy the kind of education that cultivates us as individuals who are empowered to lead our own lives and exercise leadership and influence in our community. These are all questions that originate in the ancient world and get articulated in the early modern period. This picture here is of young Cicero, one of the greatest writers on rhetoric and rhetoricians of the Roman world. And he's sort of a culture hero of the Renaissance, where I will leave off by saying that there was a big focus on Latin and Greek texts and language, and development of new techniques of identifying types of language and styles and structure and kind of an analysis of style that led into the development of both literary criticism and historical linguistics, which is called philology, the roots of which are the love of words. So let's talk about words. Another big feature of the early modern period is vernacularization. The use of Latin becomes more limited because of classicizing reforms. In other words, Latin in the Middle Ages had been a living language, and people just mangled it any way they wanted. They wrote contracts in it, and medical texts, and recipe books, and if they didn't and they kind of just were pretty loosey-goosey about how they used it, because it wasn't quite a dead language, it was semi-living. Part of that sense of historicity and the cult of Cicero and the worship of the Romans was that, no, we have to write Latin exactly like they wrote it in ancient Rome. And so Latin stops being a flexible instrument. It becomes a mode of display how closely you can write like you're a Roman in the 1st century BC. And so the practical modes of writing are taken over by vernaculars. And a vernacular the word vernacular comes from a Latin word meaning marketplace. So in other words, the vernacular language is the language of the marketplace. It's the language of everyday life. And so the vernacular takes over practical arts, medicine, law, government, all kinds of things. And these things become more and more important over this time as there's a lot of developments in all of these things. Another factor leading to vernacularization is nationalism. Where people start to become conscious of not just being a Yorkshireman or a Londoner or I'm from Madrid or the county of Anjou, but I am English or French or Spanish or Italian or Portuguese, as governments centralize and the national languages are elevated along with national literatures. In England, we have the poet Edmund Spenser, who wrote this long epic which kind of combines religious allegory with Arthurian legend called The Fairy Queen. Fascinating work. And this is supposed to be a national epic. One of the heroes is Saint George, is called Red Cross Knight, who wears the Crusader cross, the red on white, which is also the cross of Saint George, which is the flag of England. One of the sort of controversies in the early modern period then was what was called in Italy the questione della lingua, which is the question of the language. What is the right language for literature? What should people write in? The vernacular won, but it won in part by absorbing a lot of Greek and Latin terms to enrich its capacity. Let's look at the effect of that in English. Here are some of the Inkhorn words that have come into English during this time. Many survive to the present day. These include ingenious, capacity, mundane, celebrate, extol, dexterity, illustrate, superiority, fertile, contemplate, invigilate. This is what we say in Canada for proctor, like to watch over an exam. Pastoral, confidence, compendious, relinquish, frivolous, verbosity. You can get a sense of the flavor of the kind of words that come into Latin from Greek and Latin, come into English from Greek and Latin. But many words, like I said, they were just making stuff up. They were just taking everything. So there were many Inkhorn words that do not survive to the present day, like anacephalize, which is to recapitulate, annihilate, to reduce to nothing or annihilate, exolete, disused, obsolete, effete, insipid, faded, fatigate, to fatigue, illicebrus, alluring, enticing, or attractive, from the Latin illecebras, meaning snare, like a trap. Ingent, immense, very great. Obtestate, to bear witness, call upon as a witness. Now, many of these words, all of these words, will be in the Oxford English Dictionary, which tries to be a complete historical record of the English language. But it'll be marked as OBS, obsolete, not used anymore. Other borrowings and other kinds of borrowings during this period, not all Inkhorn words, not all related to humanism, but we do get a lot of prefixes that get attached to any kind of word, like re, trans, anti, macro, micro, meta, pro, contra, extra, ultra, vice, isn't like a vice president, and that root vice, vice, means in place of. We also get more words from French during this period, including amateur, avenue, ballet, bankrupt, bigot, brochure, camouflage, check, essay, etiquette, menu, shock, and ticket. Now, France continues to be a major power and kind of the cultural hegemon of Western Europe through the early modern period. If you've ever heard the term lingua franca, it means the French language, but it's used today to describe a language that is understood by a number of different peoples in different places and is used as a common language because everyone knows it. It's called today English is the lingua franca, but in the early modern period it was French. That's why it's called the lingua franca. Finally, Italy is a major power in the Renaissance, right? This is when we got all the Ninja Turtles running around, Michelangelo and Raphael and all that. And so Italy is the bee's knees. Like Venice and Florence are like the New York, Paris, Tokyo, cultural, just powerhouse of this period. They got tons of money and prestige. So we get a lot of words related to architecture and music and culture generally coming from Italian. Balcony, granite, grotto, stucco, volcano, allegro, duo, concerto, fugue. I guess that would be pronounced in fugue? I don't know. Madrigal, opera, stanza, violin. All from Italian. However, this is also the period in which there is transatlantic contact, and we get the encounter between indigenous peoples of North and South America and Europeans. And that's a whole story which we're not going to get into, but you should learn about it more. But we do get a lot of we get some words into English in this period, not directly, but indirectly through Spanish and Portuguese, who through the 1500s had a lot more contact with North America, with the Americas than England did. England didn't establish a colony in the Americas until like 1605 or somewhere around there. 1604, I think, is when Jamestown was founded. So from, I think, the Carib language, we get the words barbecue, canoe, cigar, and tobacco, which leads me to believe that the Carib natives of Hispaniola had the highest standard of living. You're just smoking at a barbecue and just going canoeing. Just sounds nice. We had to ruin it all. Anyway, barbecue, canoe, cigar, cocoa, maize, potato, tobacco, tomato, all from Native American languages via Spanish and Portuguese. We also get a bunch of words for various kinds of booze from Spanish during this period, and clothes too. Spain was a major innovator in fashion. This was a period of linguistic freedom. We're going to talk a little bit about the kind of popularly known fact that Shakespeare invented 3,000 words. And I love this meme here. Mr. Shakespeare, you can't just make up words and expect everyone to start using them. That's where you're wrong, kiddo. Shakespeare, famously, a lot of words appear for the first time in his work. Did he invent them? Maybe. Maybe they just appeared for the first time. There's a lot of other people who invented or seem to have invented or to be the first attestation of many words during this period as well. Because people were just, like Thomas Wilson was explaining about in the previous slide, people were just making up words nonstop. And they would continue to do so until the 18th century, when this meme lord right here, Samuel Johnson, wrote the dictionary. And so that period of linguistic freedom of the early modern period, which empowers and enables a lot of the enormous linguistic and literary creativity of the English Renaissance, would come to an end. Grammar would be fixed, and there would be, you couldn't just you had less freedom to just make up words after that. So this video went a little long, and I'm entirely happy with that, because I think this stuff is really interesting, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll ask me any questions that you have about this material, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!